The sound of sirens had become such a constant in my life that, at times, I caught myself humming their rhythm during quiet moments. My name is Daniel Carter, and for the past 15 years, I've worked as a paramedic on the streets of Boston. Every shift is a dance with mortality, a relentless reminder of how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change. But in all those years, nothing could have prepared me for the night when I personally crossed the threshold between life and death. An experience that would forever alter everything I believed about existence itself. The human body is both incredibly resilient and terrifyingly fragile. As paramedics, we witness this paradox daily. We see people survive injuries that should have been fatal, while others slip away from something as seemingly minor as a fall. I had always been fascinated by the mysteries of life and death. But they remained professional curiosities, things I observed from the outside. Until that night in November 2023. Looking back now, I see that my entire career had been preparing me for what was to come. Though I had no way of knowing it then. Every life I saved, every life I lost, and every family I comforted were all threads in a tapestry I couldn't yet see. The weight of these experiences had shaped me, molded my understanding of death, though I would soon learn how limited that understanding truly was. That particular November night started like any other shift. I arrived at Station 21 at 6 p.m., just as the early winter sunset cloaked the city in darkness. The station was my second home, filled with the familiar sense of industrial cleaning products, burnt coffee, and the lingering aroma of whatever the previous shift had cooked for dinner. The walls were adorned with safety protocols, duty rosters, and photos of past and present crew members. Among them was a picture from my first day on the job, a younger, clean-shaven version of myself, standing proudly in a crisp uniform, unaware of how much this career would change me. That night, my partner was Josh Martinez, a relatively new paramedic with 2 years under his belt. He had the enthusiasm I remembered from my early days, tempered by the quiet caution that comes from seeing too much too soon. We performed our standard equipment check, methodically verifying drug quantities, testing the monitor, and ensuring the oxygen tanks were full. It was a ritual as natural as breathing, one that could mean the difference between life and death. "Looks like we're in for a busy one," Josh muttered, scrolling through his phone. "Full moon tonight." I smirked at the old paramedic superstition. "Don't start with that full moon stuff. I've run the numbers, it's confirmation bias." Josh grinned. "Tell that to the psych ward. They'll show you their admission stats." Before we could finish the conversation, our first call came through. Chest pain at a downtown restaurant. Routine stuff, or so we thought. The patient was a 67-year-old woman named Margaret Wheeler, out for dinner with her family when she suddenly felt a crushing pain in her chest. When we arrived, she was pale and clammy, struggling to breathe, classic heart attack symptoms. We worked quickly, falling into the well-practiced rhythm of emergency care. I started an IV while Josh attached the cardiac monitor. The EKG confirmed what we suspected, a massive heart attack. We administered aspirin and nitroglycerin, radioed ahead to the cardiac unit at Mass General, and loaded her into the ambulance. Everything we did was textbook, precise, efficient, and by the book. But sometimes, even perfect isn't enough. Halfway to the hospital, Margaret went into cardiac arrest. The next 20 minutes were a blur of CPR, medications, and defibrillation attempts. Twice, we got her back, only to lose her again. By the time we reached the hospital, she was gone. I had lost patients before. It's an unavoidable part of the job. But something about Margaret's death felt different. Maybe it was the way her daughter looked at us as we worked on her mother, her eyes filled with desperate hope. Or maybe it was the way Margaret had squeezed my hand just before she coded, as if trying to anchor herself to this world. Whatever it was, her death cast a shadow over the rest of the shift. But there was no time to dwell on it. The calls kept coming. A broken arm at a basketball game. An elderly man with pneumonia. A fender bender with minor injuries. Each one demanded our full focus, our complete attention, even as Margaret's face lingered in the back of my mind. At around 9 p.m., we got the call that would be our last of the shift. A motorcycle accident on Commonwealth Avenue. The victim was young, probably no more than 19 or 20. He had been wearing a helmet, But at the speeds involved, it hadn't been enough. We found him crumpled against a guardrail, his motorcycle a twisted mass of metal 30 feet away. The scene was chaos, flashing police lights, onlookers filming with their phones, the acrid smell of spilled gasoline mixing with the metallic scent of blood. His injuries were catastrophic, but he was still breathing when we reached him. We did everything we could, fighting against time and probability, trying to keep him alive long enough to reach the trauma center. He died in the ambulance. His last words, a barely audible, "Mom." Another life slipped away, another family shattered. The rest of the shift blurred into the routine of paperwork, equipment cleanup, and silent processing of grief. By the time 11:30 p.m. rolled around, I was physically and emotionally drained. The station was quiet as I gathered my things from my locker, changing out of my uniform, the fabric heavy with the weight of the shift. I thought about calling Sarah, my wife, but it was late. She had learned to sleep through the nights I worked, though she always left the porch light on for me. A small gesture, but one that meant everything. The night air was crisp as I stepped outside, carrying the sharp bite of approaching winter. A light rain had fallen earlier, leaving the streets slick and reflective under the glow of streetlights. A thick fog had settled over the city, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly shadows. The weather matched my mood, gray, heavy, contemplative. As I walked to my car, a reliable, if unremarkable, Honda Civic, I found myself thinking about Margaret and Jason, adding their faces to the mental gallery of those I'd lost. Each death leaves a mark. Each one adds weight to the invisible burden we carry. Some paramedics cope through dark humor, others through exercise or meditation. For me, it was always quiet reflection, trying to make sense of the seemingly random cruelty of death. I had no idea that, within minutes, I would become the patient, that I was about to experience death firsthand, and that everything I thought I knew about life and existence was about to be shattered. The fog had thickened during my short time inside the station, turning the familiar streets of Boston into an eerie, otherworldly landscape. Streetlights glowed like halos in the mist, and the few cars still on the road moved like phantoms through the dense gray air. I drove carefully, hyper-aware of the slick pavement beneath my tires. After a shift like tonight, losing 2 patients in a matter of hours, the last thing I wanted was to become another statistic. I was about 10 minutes from home, thinking about a hot shower and the leftover lasagna waiting in the fridge. When it happened, later, I would learn that the other driver had a blood alcohol level more than twice the legal limit. He had been celebrating a promotion, lost track of how many drinks he'd had, and made the fatal decision to drive himself home. But in that moment, all I saw were a pair of headlights appearing through the fog, like angry, glowing eyes, barreling straight toward me. Time slowed. My paramedic training kicked in. Even as I was about to become the victim, I knew the roads were wet. I knew my tires wouldn't grip in time. But I turned the wheel anyway, an instinctive attempt to avoid the collision. The world erupted into chaos. The tires screeched, struggling for traction. My car spun. My body slammed against the driver's side door. There was a moment of weightlessness, like I was floating, then impact. Metal crunched, glass shattered. For a split second, there was silence. Then the world exploded in motion again, spinning, tumbling, flipping. The seatbelt bit into my shoulder as my car rolled down an embankment. The airbag deployed, slamming into my chest with the force of a sledgehammer. Pain. Searing, blinding pain. Then, nothing. Darkness. When I regained awareness, I expected pain, the crushing, suffocating weight of my injuries. I expected the chaotic sounds of sirens, voices shouting, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. Instead, there was silence. Not an empty, lifeless silence, but something vast, deep, and full of presence. I wasn't in my car anymore. I wasn't lying broken on the wet asphalt. And yet, I was aware, more aware than I had ever been in my life. At first, I had no sense of form. There was no weight, no body, just pure existence. It was as if my consciousness had been untethered from the limits of flesh and bone, expanded into something beyond human comprehension. Then came the light. It wasn't a tunnel like so many near-death experiences describe. It was everywhere, permeating everything, including me. It wasn't blinding. but alive, a warmth that didn't burn, a brilliance that didn't hurt my eyes, though I no longer had physical eyes to see. And in that instant, I understood. This light wasn't just illumination, it was conscious. It carried love so powerful, so absolute, that I felt like I had spent my entire life starving without even knowing it. I had never truly known love until this moment. A presence surrounded me, not with arms, not with words, but with a knowing that filled every fiber of my being. And though no voice spoke aloud, I understood who it was. Jesus, not as a distant historical figure or religious concept, but as something far more real than I had ever imagined, more real than the streets of Boston, than my body, than time itself. He didn't look like the paintings. He wasn't bound by physical form, but his presence was unmistakable. I didn't need to ask if it was him, I just knew. His essence radiated a love so overwhelming that I wanted to fall to my knees. If I even had knees in this state. In that moment, everything made sense. I saw my entire life in an instant, not as a series of events, but as a single, connected reality. Every patient I had ever tried to save, every person I had comforted, every failure, every regret, every moment of love or indifference, all of it mattered. I saw Margaret Wheeler, the woman we lost earlier that night. She was there, not in the broken body we left at Mass General, but whole, radiant. She smiled at me, her presence filled with peace, free from the pain and fear that had marked her last moments on Earth. I saw Jason, the young motorcyclist. He was there too, his eyes no longer filled with terror, but with understanding. I could feel the weight of his mother's grief still lingering in the world below. But here, he was not suffering. I felt the reality of every soul I had encountered in my years as a paramedic, not as random names on incident reports, but as real, eternal beings, each with their own journey beyond the limits of time. And then, something even greater unfolded. Time itself unraveled before me. I had always thought of time as linear, moving in a straight, unstoppable line from past to present to future. But now, I saw it differently, as a tapestry, where every moment existed simultaneously. Past, present, future, all woven together, each thread connected. And in that tapestry, I saw something incredible. Prayers, not as words drifting into nothingness, but as living streams of light, flowing like rivers through the fabric of existence. Some were small, like whispers. Others were powerful, luminous currents, shaping the world in ways I had never imagined. I saw prayers rising from hospital rooms, from desperate mothers holding their dying children, from broken men whispering in the dark when they thought no one was listening. And I saw the responses, not always immediate, not always in the way people expected, but always met with love, always shifting reality in ways unseen. Why are you showing me this? The question wasn't spoken aloud, but Jesus understood. His presence radiated not judgment, but deep, overwhelming love. Because you are part of it. The words weren't heard with ears, but felt deep within my being. Because you are part of the story. It wasn't just about my life as a paramedic, my years of trying to save lives. It was about something far bigger. Every life I had touched, every person I had fought for, even the ones I had lost, they had all been part of something I couldn't see until now. But then, as I stood in the presence of eternity, I felt something shift, a pull. It wasn't violent, but it was insistent, like being caught in the current of a river, tugging me backward. I became aware of my body again, of pain, of the distant sound of sirens and voices. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in the warmth, in the love that had no end. But Jesus wasn't sending me away. He wasn't rejecting me. He was giving me a choice. Return, or stay. The moment stretched endlessly and instantly at the same time. I wanted to stay. Every fiber of my being longed for it. But then I saw her. Sarah, my wife, alone in our bed, her arms wrapped around my pillow, not knowing that just miles away, my body was lying broken on the street. I saw my colleagues, Josh, Mike, Sarah Chen, their faces streaked with sweat and panic as they worked desperately to bring me back. I saw James Morty, the drunk driver, standing dazed by the side of the road, his entire future teetering on the edge of redemption or destruction. I saw my life, not as something to be escaped, but as unfinished work. And I knew, I had to go back. I turned to Jesus. Though I had never physically moved, his love didn't waver, didn't diminish. He wasn't sending me away. He was sending me back. A final surge of understanding, peace, and purpose filled me, and then, pain. Blinding, crushing pain. The weight of my own body. The pressure of broken ribs. A sharp gasp of air flooding my lungs. And then, a voice, filled with shock and relief. We got him back. We got him back. The first thing I felt was pain, blinding, suffocating, unbearable pain. It flooded every inch of my body. A stark contrast to the overwhelming love I had just experienced. My ribs felt like they had been crushed under a truck. My chest burned as if I had inhaled fire. My limbs were leaden, unresponsive. I wanted to open my eyes. But even that felt impossible. The heaviness of existence had returned. And then I heard a voice, sharp, urgent, and filled with shock. We got him back. We got him back. It was Sarah Chen, my colleague. She sounded out of breath, her voice breaking with emotion. I could hear other sounds too, the distant wail of sirens, the static of a radio, voices calling out medical updates. The smell of gasoline and burned rubber filled my nostrils, making me cough involuntarily. The pain from that small movement sent a fresh wave of agony crashing over me. I was back, and I immediately understood what that meant. The divine presence, the light, the love. I had left it behind. I was no longer standing outside of time, no longer bathed in the infinite love that had wrapped around me like a warm current. The weight of the world had slammed back into me, and it felt cruelly small in comparison. A deep ache settled in my chest, not just from the broken ribs, but from the loss of what I had just experienced. A hand squeezed mine. Daniel? I knew that voice. Josh. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh glow of flashing red and blue lights. His face came into focus, his eyes wide, his forehead slick with sweat. I had never seen him look so shaken. Can you hear me? He asked, his voice tight. I swallowed, my throat raw. Yeah. Josh let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a sob. Jesus, man, you scared the hell out of us. I turned my head slightly, a painful mistake, and saw Mike Thompson kneeling beside me, his hands still on my chest. He had been doing CPR on me. That realization hit like a truck. I had been dead, not unconscious, not in shock, dead. For how long? Before I could ask, Sarah Chen's face appeared over me, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands shaking as she pressed an oxygen mask over my face. Just breathe, okay? We're taking you in now. I wanted to tell her I had already been somewhere else, that I had seen something more real than anything I could ever describe. But I couldn't find the words. The pain blurred the ride to Mass General into a series of fragmented moments, flashing lights reflecting off the ceiling, the steady beeping of the heart monitor, the rhythmic pressure of Sarah checking my pulse. BP's holding, she muttered to Josh, who sat beside her. Good, Josh said, though his voice was still tight. He wasn't just looking at my vitals, he was watching me. I knew that look. I had seen it on so many families who had just watched a loved one be brought back from the brink. I was a miracle, but I was the one who felt like something had been lost. I wanted to cry, not from pain, not from fear, but from the deep, aching sense that I had left something behind, that I had been sent back for a reason. The only question was, why? By the time we reached the adrenaline had worn off, and the reality of my injuries set in. Fractured ribs, a concussion, a dislocated shoulder, internal bruising, but no spinal damage, no brain trauma. In other words, I was lucky. Or, as I now knew without a doubt, it wasn't luck at all. Damn, Carter, one of the attending nurses said as they wheeled me into a trauma bay. Didn't think we'd be treating one of our own tonight. I managed a weak smirk. Guess I needed to see things from the other side. If only they knew. Through the haze of IV pain meds and exhaustion, I saw Sarah rush into the room. My wife. Her hair was messy, her sweatshirt rumpled, like she had thrown it on in a panic. Her blue eyes were wide with fear, scanning my face like she wasn't sure if she could trust what she was seeing. She looked so small standing there, arms wrapped around herself, like she was holding herself together. When she saw me awake, her hand shot up to cover her mouth, a sob catching in her throat. I reached for her with my good arm. Sarah. She rushed forward, gripping my hand in both of hers, tears streaking down her face. Oh my God, Daniel. She let out a shaky breath. They called. They said you. Her voice broke. I know, I whispered. She closed her eyes tightly, pressing my knuckles to her lips. Don't ever do that to me again. I let out a weak laugh, but it turned into a cough. Not exactly part of the plan. She shook her head, blinking rapidly, trying to process everything. You were gone, Danny. They said. She swallowed. They said you were dead. I hesitated. How could I explain what I had seen? How could I make her understand that death wasn't what we thought it was? I squeezed her hand. I was. Her breath hitched. But you're here. I nodded. Yeah, and I have so much to tell you. Over the next few hours, as doctors ran tests and nurses checked my vitals, I barely spoke, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how. How do you explain that you had stood in the presence of Jesus himself? That you had seen the fabric of time, the living threads of prayer? That you had experienced love so vast it had shattered every concept of existence you once had? I knew one thing. I couldn't go back to life as it was before. I had been given a second chance, and I wouldn't waste it. The steady beeping of the heart monitor filled the dimly lit hospital room. A rhythmic reminder that I was still here, alive, but I wasn't the same. Physically, I was battered, fractured ribs, a concussion, bruised organs, but nothing compared to what had changed inside me. My body had returned, but my soul had been altered by what I had seen. I had died. I had been there, and now I was back, carrying the weight of something too vast for words. Sarah sat beside my bed, her fingers gently laced through mine. She hadn't let go since she arrived, as if afraid that if she did, I might slip away again. Danny, she whispered, I need to ask you something. I turned my head slightly toward her, wincing at the pain that shot down my neck. Yeah? She hesitated. Do you remember anything? From when you were gone? Her voice was cautious, almost afraid of the answer. I swallowed. I had spent hours trying to form the words to explain what I had seen. But how do you describe eternity? How do you tell someone you stood in the presence of Jesus himself? That you had seen time as a tapestry, prayers as living threads weaving through existence? That I had been given a choice, to stay or to return? That love itself had called me back? I glanced at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, the fear still lingering beneath the relief. I knew she wasn't asking out of curiosity, she was searching for hope. I took a slow breath. Yeah, Sarah, I remember everything. Her grip tightened around my hand. Tell me. I turned my gaze toward the window, where the faint glow of Boston's city lights shimmered beyond the fogged-up glass. How could I make her understand? I wasn't alone. I began. I was. And I wasn't. It wasn't like here. There was no time, no space, just being. She didn't speak, just listened, her fingers still wrapped around mine, grounding me to this world even as my mind replayed the infinite light I had stood within. I saw people. Sarah, I continued. Margaret, the woman we lost earlier that night. Jason, the kid from the motorcycle crash. They were whole, at peace. I swallowed, the lump in my throat growing. They weren't afraid. Sarah's breath caught, and then, I hesitated, because this was the part one didn't know how to explain. I met him. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Who? I turned to look at her. Jesus. She inhaled sharply but didn't interrupt. She just squeezed my hand, urging me to continue. He wasn't like the paintings. I said softly. He wasn't just some historical figure. He was everything. Love itself. More real than anything I've ever known. When he looked at me, Sarah, it was like, I paused, struggling for the right words. Like he had known me forever. Like I had never been alone. Not for a single second of my life. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. I swallowed hard and continued. He showed me things, not just about me, but about all of us. About how our lives connect. How every moment, every prayer, every act of love matters. I saw prayers, not as words, but as living things. Light, energy, shaping the world in ways we can't even begin to understand. Sarah's free hand pressed to her lips, her shoulders trembling. He let me choose. I whispered. I could have stayed. I wanted to stay. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. Then why didn't you? I exhaled, feeling the weight of that moment all over again. Because of you. Because of Josh, Mike, Sarah Chen. Because of people I haven't even met yet. I wasn't done. Sarah let out a quiet sob and leaned over, pressing her forehead to my hand. I thought I lost you, she whispered. I gently ran my thumb over her knuckles. You didn't, she sniffled, sitting back up, swiping at her tears. So what now? I let my head sink into the pillow. That was the question, wasn't it? I had come back. But for what? I knew I couldn't go back to life as it had been before, not after what I had seen. Not after what I now understood. I had been given a second chance. But what did that mean? Conversations with the living. Over the next few days, I found myself telling my story again and again. Not to everyone, only to those who needed to hear it. Josh visited on my second day in the hospital. He sat beside my bed, gripping his knees, looking shaken in a way I had never seen before. You were gone, man, he said quietly. I was there. I saw it. I know. His hands clenched. What was it like? I studied him. Josh was a good paramedic. But I could see something in his eyes. Fear. So I told him. Not everything, but enough. Enough to let him know that death wasn't what we thought it was. That we weren't alone. That every soul we had ever fought for mattered. Even when we lost them. He swallowed hard, nodding, his Adam's apple bobbing. That's good to know. And I could see it, the weight lifting from his shoulders. I met James Morty 3 weeks later. The man who had hit me. The man who had ended my life. If only for 13 minutes. I had expected anger when I saw him. But it never came. He looked worse than I did, hollowed out, broken, haunted. When he stepped into my hospital room, he looked like he was waiting for me to tell him I hated him. I didn't. Instead, I said, I forgive you. His face crumbled. His breath hitched. He broke down right in front of me. And I knew, in that moment, that this was part of why I had come back. Not just for Sarah, not just for my friends, but for him too. To tell him that his life wasn't over. That he had a choice. Just like I did. And that forgiveness was his first step forward. I didn't know what the road ahead would look like. But I knew one thing for certain. I hadn't been sent back to keep this to myself. I had a story to tell. A message to share. Not about death, but about life. What it really meant. And about love. The kind of love that never leaves us. Never abandons us. And never, ever ends. The first morning I woke up in my own bed. It felt strange. For weeks, I had been surrounded by hospital walls. The constant hum of monitors. And the sterile smell of disinfectant. Now, I was home. Wrapped in my own blankets. The soft breathing of Sarah beside me. The comforting scent of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. But something was different. Not just the way my ribs still ached when I breathed too deeply. Not just the way I felt weak. Like my body was still catching up with my soul. No, it was something deeper. I wasn't the same man who had climbed into his car that night. Exhausted from another shift, I had left something behind in the wreckage of that crash. And in its place, I had brought something back. I just didn't know what to do with it yet. The first few days home were quiet. Sarah fussed over me, making sure I took my meds. That I rested enough. That I didn't push myself too hard. She had always been strong. But I could see the fear still lingering behind her eyes, the fear of almost losing me. I tried to tell her that I wasn't going anywhere. That I had been sent back for a reason. But even as I said it, I realized, I didn't know what that reason was yet. On the outside, everything was the same. The city was still moving at its relentless pace. The news was still filled with tragedy. Life went on. But I couldn't unsee what I had seen. Couldn't unfeel the love that had surrounded me in that place beyond time. And I couldn't ignore the deep, gnawing certainty that I had been sent back for a purpose. I wasn't cleared for duty yet. But I still kept in touch with my crew. So when Josh called me one night, his voice strained, I knew something was wrong. We lost a kid today, he said, exhaling shakily. 17. Overdose. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry, man. Josh sighed. I don't know, Danny. Sometimes I wonder if we're even making a difference. I understood that feeling too well. We saved lives. Yes. But we also lost them. And the ones we lost, they stayed with us. You are, I told him, even when it doesn't feel like it. He let out a bitter chuckle. Yeah? How do you know? Because I had seen it. Because I had felt it. Because every act of love, every moment of kindness, every fight to keep someone breathing mattered in ways we couldn't comprehend. But how did I explain that to him? How did I put into words what I had seen? I took a slow breath. Because I've been there, Josh. I've seen what's on the other side. And I know, none of it is wasted. Every person we help, every life we touch, it all matters. Silence. Then, a quiet, unsteady breath. Yeah? Another pause. Then, softer. Thanks, man. We hung up, but I knew that moment wasn't random. I had been sent back for moments like this. The more time passed, the more I realized I couldn't keep this to myself. I had been given a glimpse of something beyond this world, not just for my own understanding, but to share it. But where did I even begin? I wasn't a preacher. I wasn't a theologian. I was just a paramedic. A guy who had seen too much, lost too many, and died on a foggy Boston street one November night. And yet, I knew. This was part of why I had come back. I had to tell people. I had to let them know that death wasn't the end. That there was love beyond comprehension waiting for them. That every prayer, every act of kindness, every small moment of grace rippled into eternity. But how? Who would believe me? A few days later, Mike Thompson showed up at my door. He looked uncomfortable, shifting on his feet like he wasn't sure if he should be there. Hey, he said, got a minute? I waved him in. Always. He sat down, rubbing his hands together. I've been thinking a lot about that night. About you. I stayed quiet, letting him find the words. When we were working on you. He hesitated. It felt like something was helping us. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt it. A chill ran down my spine. I nodded, because there was. He looked at me sharply. You remember? I met his gaze. I remember everything. He exhaled, shaking his head. Man, I don't even know if I believe in that stuff. But when you came back, he swallowed hard. I don't know. It felt like a miracle. I smiled faintly. It was. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling between us. Then, quietly, he asked, what was it like? So I told him. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Enough for him to understand that what happened wasn't just luck. Enough for him to know that something bigger was at work that night. When he left, he shook my hand, holding on just a little longer than normal. And I knew, this was why I had been sent back. Not just to live, but to change lives. I wasn't the same. I couldn't be. Every day, I woke up with the weight of what I had seen, what I had felt, what I now knew to be true beyond any doubt. Love was real. Death was not the end. Every moment mattered, and I had been given a second chance, not to keep that to myself, but to share it. I didn't know exactly where this road would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't walking it alone. It had been almost 3 months since the accident, but time felt different now. Some days, it seemed like I had been back for years, carrying the weight of what I had seen. Other days, I woke up still expecting to feel the warmth of that light, the overwhelming love that had surrounded me. But no matter how much time passed, one truth remained. I couldn't go back to the way things were before. I had been sent back for a reason. I just had to figure out what that reason was. Getting cleared to return to duty wasn't easy. My body had healed, but my mind, that was another story. Before my accident, paramedic work had been second nature. I knew how to move, how to assess a patient within seconds, how to shut out the chaos and focus on what needed to be done. But now I saw more. Every patient, every person in pain. I didn't just see their injuries anymore. I saw their souls. I saw the weight of their fears, their regrets, their prayers, even the things they left unsaid. I had always thought I was fighting to save bodies. Now I realized, I had been fighting for something far greater. And I would never see this job the same way again. The night before my first shift, I barely slept. Sarah had fallen asleep with her hand on my chest, like she was still afraid she might wake up and find me gone. I ran my fingers through her hair, whispering, I'm still here. I don't know if she heard me, but I knew she felt it. The next evening, I stepped back into Station 21, the place I had called home for years. The scent of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner hit me the second I walked in. The same crew photos lined the walls. My locker was still there, untouched. Everything was the same. But I wasn't. Josh was already inside, leaning against the ambulance bay door with a cup of coffee. When he saw me, he grinned. Back from the dead, huh? I smirked. Told you I wasn't going anywhere. We bumped fists, but I could see it in his eyes. He was watching me, waiting to see if I was really ready. Maybe I was watching myself too. We had been on shift for about 4 hours when we got the call. Cardiac arrest, residential home, elderly male, CPR in progress. Routine. Except nothing felt routine anymore. Josh drove while I sat in the passenger seat, watching the city lights blur past. I could feel it before we even got there, that heaviness. The pull of something beyond just medicine. When we arrived, a woman in her 50s met us at the door, her eyes wide with panic, hands trembling. He's in the bedroom, please. Hurry. We rushed in. An older man, probably in his late 70s, lay motionless on the floor, his chest still beneath his pajama shirt. A home defibrillator was set up beside him, its automated voice repeating, "No shock advised. Continue CPR." His wife knelt beside him, tears running down her face as she pressed her hands over his. "John," she sobbed, "please, don't leave me." Josh and I moved fast. CPR, airway management, meds. I had done this 1,000 times before. But something was different. I could feel him, not just his body, but his soul. He was on the edge, right there, teetering between this world and the next. And I saw it, the light, just beyond him. I knew that light. I had been inside it. And I knew he was ready. Everything in my training told me to keep going, to fight. But for the first time in my career, I felt something else. Not yet, not like this. I turned to his wife, my hands still pressing against her husband's chest. "Talk to him," I said gently. "Tell him what you need to say." She looked at me, startled, but something in my face must have told her to trust me. She leaned down, her voice shaking. "John, I love you," she whispered. "I love you so much. If you need to go, it's okay. I'll be okay." A single tear slipped from his closed eyes. And in that moment, I felt him let go. Josh checked the monitor. Flatline. Time of death, 10:47 p.m. I sat back, exhaling. I had fought death my entire career. But tonight, I understood it. Back at the station, Josh was quiet. He kept looking at me like I had done something he didn't understand. Finally, he leaned against the locker room bench and said, "That was different." I met his gaze. "Yeah, it was." He exhaled. "How did you?" He shook his head. "How did you know?" I didn't answer right away. Because how could I explain it? How could I tell him that I had seen what was waiting on the other side? That I had stood in the presence of Jesus himself? That I now understood that death wasn't just something to fight, it was a door. A passage, a transition? How did I explain that sometimes the greatest thing we can do for someone isn't to pull them back, but to let them go in peace? I met his eyes. I just knew. Josh studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I think you did." In the weeks that followed, I started talking. Not to everyone, not all at once, but to those who needed to hear it. I spoke to families who had lost loved ones, letting them know that death wasn't the end, that there was something more, something greater, something filled with love beyond comprehension. I spoke to paramedics who had carried too much grief, too many ghosts, and told them that nothing they did was in vain. I spoke to James Morty, the man who had crashed into me that night, who was still struggling with his guilt. And I told him, "You were forgiven before you even asked." Because I had learned something in that 13 minutes of death. We are not alone. We are never alone. And we are loved beyond anything we can imagine. I was sent back to share that truth. And that's exactly what I was going to do. Somewhere along the way, my job as a paramedic had changed. I still responded to calls, still treated wounds, still fought to save lives. But now, I wasn't just looking at the injuries, I was seeing the souls behind them. It wasn't something I could explain to my colleagues in medical terms. It wasn't something I could document in a patient report. But every call, every person I touched, every breath that stayed or left, I felt something beyond the science, something I had never truly noticed before. It wasn't just about saving lives anymore. It was about being present in the moments that mattered most. It was a cold February night when we got the call. Possible suicide attempt. Young female. No further details available. I felt the familiar weight in my chest, not fear, not stress, but something deeper. Josh glanced at me as we climbed into the ambulance. He had started noticing things lately. Not just how I worked, but how I carried myself. How I seemed to sense things before they happened. He didn't ask, but I knew he wanted to. We arrived at a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. A woman in her early 20s sat on the bathroom floor, knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her body together. Her wrists were wrapped in a makeshift towel bandage, blood soaking through, not deep enough to be fatal, but deep enough to show her pain was real. Her eyes were distant, her face pale. I crouched in front of her. "Hey," I said softly, "I'm Daniel. I'm a paramedic. Can I take a look at your wrists?" She didn't move, didn't resist, but she didn't engage, either. Her roommate stood in the doorway, tears running down her face. "She hasn't said a word since I found her," she whispered. "I don't know what to do." I turned back to the girl. I had seen this before. People whose wounds weren't just physical. People who had decided, for reasons they believed were final, that life was too heavy to carry. And in that moment, I didn't see just a patient. I saw a soul on the edge of something deeper. I reached for the bandage gently, careful not to spook her. "I'm gonna fix this up, okay? But first, I need to ask, do you want to stay?" Josh shot me a sharp look. We weren't supposed to phrase things that way. We were supposed to stabilize, transport, let the psych unit handle the emotional side of it. But this wasn't about protocols. It was about her. Her lip trembled, her body shook slightly, as if she was holding back a tidal wave of emotion. Then, finally, she whispered, "I don't know." I nodded, like she had just given me the most important answer of my career. Because in a way, she had. "You don't have to know right now," I said gently. "You just have to be here. And if you decide to stay, I promise, this pain you're feeling, it's not the whole story." Her eyes flickered, not hope, not yet, but curiosity. Like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. And I knew, I had been sent back for this. For moments like this. Back at the station, Josh leaned against the lockers, arms crossed. He wasn't laughing, wasn't making jokes. He was studying me. "All right," he said finally. "You gotta tell me, man, what happened to you?" I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He scoffed. "Don't do that. We've been working together for years. And you've always been good at this job. But now?" He shook his head. "It's like you see things we don't. Like you knew exactly what that girl needed to hear tonight." I hesitated. This was the moment. I could brush it off, make up some easy answer. Or I could tell him the truth. I chose the truth. I inhaled slowly. "Because I died, Josh." His expression didn't change. He just stared at me, waiting for me to continue. So I told him. Not the clinical version. Not the, "I flatlined for 13 minutes, version. But the real version. I told him about the light. The presence. The overwhelming love that had surrounded me. I told him about how I had seen Jesus himself. How I had been given a choice to stay or come back. And most of all, I told him why I came back. For people like Margaret Wheeler, who had squeezed my hand one last time before slipping away. For people like Jason, the young motorcyclist who had whispered for his mom with his last breath. For people like the girl tonight, sitting alone in her apartment, wondering if life was still worth living. Josh didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at me, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he exhaled and said, "Holy shit." I laughed, not at him, but at the simplicity of his reaction. Because I got it. It was a lot to take in. But he wasn't laughing. He wasn't dismissing me. He was thinking. That conversation with Josh was the first of many. Some people believed me right away. Some didn't. But that wasn't my job, to convince them. My job was to share it. To tell people that death wasn't the end. That love was bigger than anything we could comprehend. That every prayer, every act of kindness, Every moment of love mattered more than we realized. I wasn't sent back to preach. I was sent back to show up. To be a presence in the moments that mattered. To be a bridge between what I had seen and the world that still struggled to believe it. Because I knew, I had stood in the presence of love itself. And I had been sent back to share it. The night after my conversation with Josh, I sat on my porch, staring out at the quiet street. The crisp winter air bit at my skin. But I barely noticed. My mind was somewhere else, back in that light, in that presence. Even now, after all these months, I could still feel it. Not in the same overwhelming way, but like a fire quietly burning inside me. I had told Josh the truth, and he had listened. He hadn't laughed, hadn't called me crazy. He had just let it sit, his mind working through it in the only way he knew how. And I knew, that was only the beginning. I wasn't here to preach. I wasn't here to convince anyone of what I had seen. I was here to live it. 2 weeks later, we got another call. Stroke victim, mid-60s, unconscious, family on scene. Josh and I arrived at the house, moving quickly as we always did. The moment we stepped inside, I felt it, that familiar heaviness, that presence that told me something bigger was happening. On the couch, a man lay slumped to one side, his breathing shallow, his eyes barely open. His wife knelt beside him, gripping his hand so tightly her knuckles had turned white. I had seen this look before, the look of someone who wasn't ready to say goodbye. Josh checked vitals. BP was dropping, breathing slowing, time was running out. The wife looked up at me, her eyes filled with raw, desperate emotion. "Please," she whispered, "don't let him go." I kneeled beside her. "Tell him what you need to say." She blinked at me, startled. This wasn't standard procedure. We were trained to stabilize first, talk later. But I had learned something since my own death. Sometimes the words mattered just as much as the medicine. She hesitated, then turned back to him, her voice trembling. "I love you. I love you so much. If you can hear me, if you can hold on, please stay." A single tear slipped from the man's eye. And then, against all odds, his breathing steadied. Josh's head snapped up from the monitor. Holy, he cut himself off, shaking his head. "I don't know how, but he's stabilizing." We loaded him onto the stretcher, rushed him into the ambulance, and by the time we reached the hospital, he was still alive. Doctors later told us it was a miracle he had made it. But I already knew that, because I had seen how love calls people back. As the weeks passed, I started noticing patterns. It wasn't just about the calls we responded to, it was about the moments within them. Some patients were meant to fight, meant to stay. Others, they were ready, and I could feel it. Not every time, not always, but when it mattered most, when someone was on the edge, when a family was clinging to hope or standing in the face of inevitable loss, I could sense it. I didn't talk about it with my colleagues, not in a way that made it sound mystical, but Josh saw it. One night after a shift, he nudged me as we walked back to the station. "You're different, man." I smirked. "You keep saying that, because it's true." He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what you brought back with you that night, but I think," he hesitated, "I think maybe I believe you." I studied him. Josh had never been religious, never talked about faith, never questioned what happened after death. But something had changed, not just in me, in him. He shook his head, laughing to himself. "Damn, never thought I'd say that." I clapped a hand on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd die and come back. So I guess we're both figuring things out." He grinned. "Yeah, I guess we are." A few days later, I got a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from again. James Morty, the man who had crashed into me, the man who had, unknowingly, killed me for 13 minutes. I had already forgiven him. I had even told him as much when we met in the hospital. But now, he wanted to talk. We met at a small coffee shop. He looked different than before, more worn down, but also, lighter somehow. He sat across from me, wrapping his hands around his cup. "I don't know why you forgave me," he said after a long pause. "I don't deserve it." I leaned forward. "None of us really deserve grace, James. That's why it's grace." He let out a shaky breath, nodding. "I quit drinking." I smiled. "Good. I started going to church." His voice cracked slightly, like he was still getting used to saying the words. I don't know what I believe yet. But I know there's something bigger than me out there. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I had been sent back for this. Not just for the patients. Not just for the paramedics who were struggling under the weight of the job. But for him, too. James looked up at me. His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in them before. Hope. I needed you to know. He said softly. That night didn't just change your life. It changed mine too. I reached across the table, gripping his arm. Then it wasn't wasted. He nodded, his jaw tightening. No, it wasn't. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know why I had been chosen to come back. Why I had been given that choice when so many others weren't. But I knew this. I was going to live differently. I wasn't going to waste this second chance. There were still more people to reach. More stories to be a part of. I had been given a gift, the knowledge that death was not the end. That love was the fabric of everything. That every prayer, every small act of kindness rippled through eternity. And now, it was my turn to pass it on. 3 months had passed since my return to work. But nothing felt the same. Not my job. Not my relationships. Not even the way I looked at the world. I had been given a second chance. But it wasn't just about living, it was about understanding. About doing something with what I had been shown. I knew now that every call, every patient, every single moment mattered more than I had ever realized before. And I wasn't about to waste it. It was a quiet night. The kind that made every paramedic nervous. Too quiet meant something big was coming. And then, it did. Pediatric seizure. 5-year-old male, not breathing. Josh and I exchanged a look. No words needed. We raced to the scene. Arriving at a small house where a woman was standing on the porch. Sobbing into the phone. My baby, she gasped as we ran up the steps. He just stopped breathing. We found him on the living room floor, a little boy. Tiny and fragile, his skin pale, his lips tinged blue. I dropped to my knees. My hands moving automatically, airway, breathing, circulation. Josh worked the bag valve mask, forcing air into his tiny lungs, while I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. It was faint, too faint. We had seconds, not minutes, seconds. His mother knelt beside me, sobbing, pleading with God under her breath. And in that moment, I felt it, the weight of something bigger pressing in. I looked down at the boy, and suddenly, it wasn't just his fragile body I saw. I saw the thread of his life, stretching forward into something greater. He wasn't meant to go. Not yet. I pressed deeper into compressions, feeling the urgency in my bones. Come on, buddy, I murmured. You're not done yet. Josh squeezed the bag harder, his jaw tight with focus. Heartbeats weak, he said, but it's there. The mother grabbed my arm. Is he? Will he? I met her eyes. He's fighting. Keep talking to him. She sobbed harder, whispering words of love, of prayer, of desperate hope. And then, a small, fragile gasp. The boy's chest rose, then fell, then rose again. Josh looked at the monitor. Holy, he exhaled. He's coming back. I didn't need the monitor to tell me. I could feel it. Later, back at the station, Josh sat across from me at the table, staring down at his coffee like it held the answers to the universe. Finally, he looked up. All right, I give up. I smirked. On what? He gestured toward me. On pretending like I don't see it. Like I don't feel it. I set my mug down. Feel what? He ran a hand through his hair. That call tonight? That kid? It wasn't just skill that brought him back. And I'm not saying it was luck. Either. It was. He hesitated, struggling to find the words. It was like you knew. Like you knew he was going to make it. I didn't speak. I just let him process. He exhaled. This has been happening too much to be random. Danny, what you brought back with you that night, you're different. And I don't mean in a bad way. I swallowed, my throat tight. I see things differently now. I admitted. Josh nodded. Yeah, I can tell. Then, more softly, he said, I believe you. The weight of those words settled between us. Heavy and real. He had finally seen enough. Felt enough. And even if he didn't understand all of it, he believed. I nodded. Good. Because he wasn't the only one. Telling my story. One day, Sarah sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She had been watching me more closely lately, studying me like she was trying to figure out who I had become. I think you need to tell more people, she finally said. I raised an eyebrow. Tell them what? She gave me a look. You know what? I exhaled. Sarah, I'm serious. She leaned forward. I see what's happening, not just with your job. With you. People need to hear this. They need to know what you saw, what you felt. I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to share it. It was that I didn't know if people were ready to hear it. But then I thought about Josh. About the mother who prayed over her son. About James Morty, the man who had killed me, who was now fighting to rebuild his life. And I realized, Sarah was right. I hadn't been sent back to stay quiet. I had been sent back to share what I had seen. Because I knew, without a doubt, without hesitation, that love was bigger than death. That life didn't end when the body stopped. That every act of kindness, every whispered prayer, every moment of love echoed into eternity. And if I didn't tell people that, if I didn't at least try, then what was the point of coming back at all? So, I started talking, not on a stage, not in front of a crowd, but in small moments, one-on-one conversations. The people who needed to hear it were the ones who found me. It was the grieving mother who had lost her child too soon. The burned-out paramedic who wasn't sure if he could keep carrying the weight of the job. The doubters, the broken, the ones who had stopped believing in anything at all. And with every conversation, I could see it, the way the truth settled in their souls. The way it changed them. Just a little. Maybe they didn't always believe me right away. But they listened, and sometimes, that was enough. Because I knew this was only the beginning. I didn't have all the answers. I still didn't know why I had been given a second chance when so many others weren't. But I knew this. I wasn't going to waste it. I was going to keep showing up. For my patients. For my friends. For strangers who needed to hear something real. Because the love I had felt on the other side, the love that had pulled me back, wasn't just for me. It was for everyone. And now, it was my turn to pass it on. Sharing my story had never been the plan. For a long time, I thought it was something too personal, too sacred, something meant only for me. But the more I talked, the more I realized this wasn't just my story. It belonged to everyone who needed hope. Everyone who had lost someone. Everyone who had been afraid of what came next. Everyone who was searching for proof that this life wasn't all there was. And now, there was no turning back. One evening, after a particularly rough shift, Josh and I stopped for late-night coffee at a diner not far from the station. The place was mostly empty. Just a few tired truckers nursing their mugs. A young couple whispering in the corner. And a man sitting alone at the counter, staring into his drink. Something about him felt heavy. Josh nudged me. You okay? You've been quiet. I sipped my coffee, eyes still on the man. I think I need to talk to him. Josh let out a small chuckle. You're getting real good at this whole spiritual intuition thing. I smirked. Yeah, well, it hasn't failed me yet. I slid out of the booth and made my way to the counter. Sitting down a few stools away from the man. Up close, he looked exhausted, not just physically, but like he was carrying something far too heavy for one person to bear. I didn't say anything right away. Just let the silence settle. Finally, he sighed and muttered, You ever feel like you're living in a world that doesn't make sense anymore? I turned toward him. Yeah, I have. He let out a dry laugh. Lucky you. You seem like you've figured something out. I studied him for a moment. You lose someone? His grip tightened around his mug. Yeah, my brother. He shook his head. He was the good one. Kind, smart, always helping people. And then one night, he just didn't wake up. I didn't say anything. Just let him talk. I can't make sense of it. He admitted, his voice cracking. If there's a God, why would he take the good ones and leave the rest of us here? I exhaled slowly. I used to ask that same question. His eyes flicked toward me. Skeptical. Yeah? I nodded. And then I died. His brow furrowed. What? So, I told him. I told him about the light. The love. The presence of Jesus himself. I told him about seeing the bigger picture, how every life, every soul, every prayer connected in ways we couldn't understand here. I didn't try to convince him. I just shared. And when I finished, he sat in stunned silence. Then, he whispered, So my brother, he's okay? I smiled. He's more than okay. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, clearing his throat. Thank you, he muttered. I needed to hear that. I nodded. I think that's why I was supposed to be here tonight. For the first time, he looked lighter. And I knew, once again, this was why I had come back. At home, Sarah had been watching everything unfold. She never questioned my experience, never doubted me. She had seen how it changed me, how it changed the people I spoke to. One night, as she sat curled up next to me on the couch, she said, I used to think faith was about believing without seeing. I turned to her, curious. And now? She smiled softly. Now I think it's about seeing through someone else's eyes. I squeezed her hand. I don't expect everyone to believe me. She shook her head. They don't have to. They just need to listen. She understood. She always had. I thought I had seen everything as a paramedic. But nothing prepared me for the call that would change my life all over again. Cardiac arrest. Elderly male. At home. We arrived at a quiet suburban house, where an older woman was sobbing in the doorway. I recognized her immediately. Margaret Wheeler's daughter. The woman who had watched me fight to save her mother's life months ago. She gasped when she saw me. You. I stepped forward. What happened? She led us inside, to where her father lay on the floor. Unresponsive. I dropped beside him, already moving through the motions. CPR. Airway. Meds. But something in me paused. This time, I felt no pull to fight. No urgency to keep him here. This time, I felt peace. His daughter knelt beside me, tears streaming down her face. Is he? I swallowed hard. I think he's ready. Her face crumpled. I don't know how to let him go. I took her hand. Tell him it's okay. She hesitated, then leaned over him, her voice shaking. Dad, I love you. Mom's waiting for you. It's okay to go. A single tear slipped from his closed eyes. And just like that, he was gone. But there was no fear, no struggle, just peace. That night, I sat in my car outside my house, staring at the stars. For the first time, I truly understood. I hadn't been sent back just to live. I had been sent back to love, to comfort, to guide, to show people that life didn't end when the heart stopped beating. It wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about being there when people needed it most. It was about carrying the love I had felt in that place beyond time and space, and bringing it into this world, one person at a time. I closed my eyes, whispering a silent prayer. Thank you for bringing me back, for showing me the truth, for giving me a purpose that was so much bigger than myself, and for never letting me walk alone. Some nights, when the world was quiet and Sarah had fallen asleep beside me, I would stare at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened. Not just the accident, not just the 13 minutes I was gone, but everything that had come after. The people I had met, the conversations that had shifted something in their hearts, the moments where I had felt that undeniable presence guiding me, nudging me forward. I had been given a second chance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just getting started. One evening, as my shift was ending, I got a call from someone I never expected. Mike Thompson. He had been one of the paramedics who worked on me that night, the one who had fought to bring me back. Hey, Carter, he said, his voice a little gruff, like he wasn't sure why he was calling. You got a minute? Yeah, of course. There was a pause. Then, softer. I need to talk to you about something. We met at a park, away from the noise of the city. Mike looked exhausted, like something had been eating at him for a long time. He didn't waste time. I've been thinking about that night, he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. The night we worked on you. I stayed quiet, letting him talk. There was a moment, he continued. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like something was in that ambulance with us. Like something was helping us. I nodded, because there was. He let out a breath. I don't know if I believe in all that, but I know what I felt, and I can't shake it. I studied him. What are you afraid of? He hesitated. That if I admit something bigger was at play, I'll have to change how I see everything. I nodded. Yeah, I get that. Another pause. Then, quieter. So what do I do? I smiled. Start by listening. As I drove home that night, something clicked into place inside me. I wasn't just here to comfort the grieving. I wasn't just here to help patients in their final moments. I was here to wake people up. To show them that there was more to this life than what we could see and touch. To remind them that none of us were alone. Not even in our darkest moments. I pulled into the driveway and sat in my car for a long time. Staring at my hands. The same hands that had done CPR on countless patients. The same hands that had once been lifeless on an ambulance stretcher. And I whispered, "All right, I hear you, I'm ready." Over the next few weeks, I found myself having more conversations like the one with Mike. Sometimes, it was with colleagues who had seen too much death and needed to know that their work mattered beyond the physical world. Sometimes, it was with strangers, people who had lost someone, people who had been searching for answers, people who just needed to hear that love was bigger than loss. And sometimes, it was just one quiet moment with someone who needed hope. The more I spoke, the more I realized, this wasn't just about me anymore. This was a mission, and I was ready to embrace it. It was just after midnight when we got the call. Car accident, single vehicle, one occupant, unconscious at the scene. We arrived to find a young man slumped over the steering wheel. His car wrapped around a guardrail. He was barely breathing, no seatbelt, massive head trauma. As I worked, pressing my fingers to his pulse, I felt something shift, that presence. That weight that told me this moment was bigger than what I could see. His pulse was weak, his body was broken, but his soul was still here. I leaned in, whispering, "Hold on, man, you're not alone." His eyelids fluttered, just for a second. Josh glanced at me. "Danny, you okay?" I swallowed hard. "Yeah," because I could feel it happening, the same thing that had happened to me. The thin space between life and death. And I knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't fighting alone. Later that night, after we handed the patient off to the trauma team, I sat outside the hospital, staring up at the sky. Josh dropped down onto the bench beside me. "All right," he said, exhaling. "You felt it, didn't you?" I glanced at him. "Yeah." He nodded slowly, like he had known the answer before he even asked. We sat in silence for a long time. Then, Josh murmured, "I think I want to know more." I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw it. A spark of belief in his eyes. The ripple effect. And I knew, this was only the beginning. A year ago, I had been a paramedic just trying to get through another shift. Now I was walking through life with a calling I never saw coming. I wasn't a preacher. I wasn't a spiritual leader. But I was a witness. A witness to the truth that we are more than just our bodies. That love does not end with death. That something greater than us is at work in every single moment. And I was going to spend the rest of my life making sure people knew it. Because I had been given a gift. And now, it was my turn to pass it on. It had been almost a year since the night I died. A year since I had felt the presence of something greater. Since I had seen beyond this world. A year since I had been given a choice, and chosen to come back. And in that year, everything had changed. I was still a paramedic. Still responding to calls. Still doing the work I had done for 15 years. But now, I saw it differently. Every life I touched. Every word I spoke. Every single moment, it all had meaning. I wasn't here to just exist. I was here to wake people up. To remind them that life was more than just the physical world they could see and touch. To show them that love never died. It had been a slow shift. The kind where you sit around waiting. Drinking stale coffee and pretending you're not waiting for something bad to happen. Then the radio crackled. Cardiac arrest. Male. Early 60s. No pulse. CPR in progress. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't know why. There was nothing unusual about the call. But something inside me told me that this one was different. When we arrived, we found the man lying on his living room floor. His wife kneeling beside him, pressing down on his chest with shaking hands. Her face was streaked with tears. He just collapsed. She choked out. 1 second he was talking. And then, I nodded, already moving, already pressing my hands to his sternum. Falling into the rhythm I knew by heart. Josh took over airway support. "Come on, man," he muttered, "stay with us." But even as I worked, even as I fought, I felt something shift. That familiar pull. I had felt it before, on the edge of life and death. This man was right there. And I could feel the presence in the room. His wife knelt beside me, clutching my arm. "Please," she whispered, "don't let him go." I hesitated, not because I wanted to stop, but because I could feel something happening. He wasn't alone. I couldn't see them, not in the way I had before. But I knew someone was here, waiting for him. And in that moment, I wasn't just a paramedic. I was a bridge. I leaned in close, my voice barely above a whisper. "If you're meant to stay, fight," I murmured. "But if you need to go, it's okay." His wife let out a quiet sob. And then, a breath. His chest rose, then fell. The monitor beeped. Josh's head snapped up. "Holy, he's back." His wife gasped. "Oh my God." I sat back on my heels, heart pounding, feeling something I couldn't explain. Because I knew he had been given the same choice I had. And he had come back. 2 days later, I was on break when my phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Carter." There was a pause, then a quiet, shaken voice. You were at my house the other night." I sat up straighter. "Yes." The man exhaled. I don't know how to say this. But I saw something." I swallowed. "What did you see?" He hesitated. "I saw my brother. He died 5 years ago. But I saw him, standing there, clear as day. He told me it wasn't my time. He told me to come back." Chills ran down my spine. I gripped the phone. "I believe you." Silence. Then, relief. "You do?" "Yeah," I said, "because I've been there too." That night, I sat outside my house, staring up at the stars. Sarah stepped onto the porch, wrapping a blanket around herself. She sat beside me, leaning her head against my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. I exhaled. "Yeah, just thinking." She smiled. "You do that a lot now." I chuckled. "Guess I have a lot to think about." She studied me for a moment. "Danny, do you ever wish you had stayed?" I considered that for a long time. Then, I shook my head. "No," I whispered, "because there's still work to do here." She squeezed my hand. "I'm glad you stayed." I kissed her forehead. "Me too." Because I knew now, this wasn't just about my story. It was about everyone who needed to hear it. I didn't know where this road would take me. I didn't know how many lives I would touch. How many moments like that night in the ambulance I would experience. But I knew this. I had died. I had seen what was beyond this world. And I had been given a second chance. Not for myself, but for every single person who needed to be reminded that they were never alone. Never forgotten. Never beyond the reach of love. This was my mission now. And I would spend the rest of my days walking it out. One step at a time. Some nights, when the city settled into silence and the hum of the world grew still, I felt it. The pull. Not a burden. Not a weight I resented, but something deeper. Something I couldn't ignore. A calling. I had spent my life saving people's bodies. But now, I knew, there was more to save than flesh and bone. It was late, almost the end of our shift, when the call came in. Overdose. Male. Mid-20s. Unconscious. Possible fentanyl. Josh and I exchanged a look. We had been getting more of these calls lately. Young people, some intentional, some accidental, but every single one left a scar. We arrived at a rundown apartment, where a frantic woman was waving from the doorway. "Hurry, please, I can't wake him up." We rushed inside. A man lay slumped against the couch, lips blue, breathing nearly non-existent. A used syringe lay on the floor beside him. Josh moved fast, prepping Narcan. I tilted the man's head back, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. Weak pulse, barely there. His sister, early 20s, shaking violently, was clutching her phone with both hands. I told him to stop. She whispered. I told him. I placed my hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "We're going to do everything we can." Josh gave the first dose. We waited. Nothing. He gave another. Then, a gasp. The man's chest heaved as his body jerked back into consciousness, his glazed eyes blinking in confusion. His sister let out a sob. "Oh, thank God." Josh exhaled. That was close. But as I looked at the young man, his hollow eyes, his trembling hands, I felt something. He wasn't just physically lost. He was spiritually drowning. And I knew I had been sent back for people like him. We transported him to the hospital, his sister riding with us in the ambulance. She held his hand the entire way, whispering, "Please, don't do this again. I can't lose you too." I stayed quiet, watching the way he avoided her eyes, watching the way shame settled over him like a heavy fog. When we arrived at the he sat up, pulling at his IV. "I don't need to stay. I'm fine." His sister's voice broke. "You almost died." He shook his head, muttering, "Maybe I should have." And just like that, everything inside me froze. Because I had been there. I had seen the other side. I knew what it was like to stand on that edge and wonder if life was still worth fighting for. So I stepped forward, lowering my voice. "Listen, man, I know what it feels like to think it's over." He scoffed. "Yeah, you ever OD before?" "No," I admitted, "but I've been dead." His tired eyes snapped to mine. His sister stilled. Josh glanced at me, but he didn't interrupt. The young man swallowed. "You're lying." I shook my head. "I wish I was." For the next few minutes, I told him, not everything, just enough. About the light, about the love I felt on the other side, about the choice I had been given, to stay or to return. I told him that life didn't end when the body gave out. That he wasn't alone. That he had a purpose he hadn't found yet, but it was waiting for him. And for the first time since we had revived him, he actually looked at me. Really looked. Like maybe, just maybe, he believed me. Like maybe, just maybe, he had been waiting to hear those exact words his entire life. Later, back at the station, Josh leaned against the ambulance bay door, arms crossed. "All right," he said, "I have a question." I smirked. "That's new." He ignored me. "How do you know when to say something? When to tell people what you saw?" I exhaled, thinking about it. "I don't." Josh frowned. "What do you mean?" I shrugged. "I just know when it's right." Josh studied me, something unreadable in his eyes. "You think that kid will make it?" I glanced at the city lights in the distance. "I don't know." Josh nodded slowly. "But you planted something in him." I met his gaze. "Yeah, and that was the point. Not to change people overnight. Not to force them to believe. But to plant something. A seed. A reminder that there was something more waiting for them than the darkness they had known. Living the mission. I had been sent back for this. Not to be a preacher. Not to stand on a stage. But to meet people where they were. To show them that life was more than suffering, addiction, loneliness, or grief. To remind them that love never ended, even when the heart stopped beating. And if just one person, one lost, hurting soul, chose to keep fighting because of something I said, then coming back was worth it. The more I spoke, the more I saw the ripple effect. People started asking questions. People started listening. Some, like Josh, were still skeptical, but they felt something shifting. Others, like that young man in the simply needed to hear that their story wasn't over yet. And me? I just kept showing up. Because I knew this was just the beginning. The longer I lived after that night, the night I died and came back, the more I realized something. It wasn't always about the words I spoke. It wasn't always about sharing my story. About telling people what I had seen. Sometimes, the most powerful thing I could do was just be there. It was late, one of those cold, damp nights where the city felt like it was holding its breath. Then the radio crackled. Unknown medical, woman, late 30s, possible distress. Josh and I responded. Sirens off, pulling up to a small apartment complex. A neighbor had called it in. Something's wrong with her. But I don't know what. We knocked, waited. Then, the door creaked open, and a woman stood in the shadows. She was thin, pale, hollow-eyed, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hands trembled as she pulled the door open wider. "You called?" I asked gently. She nodded but didn't speak. Josh and I exchanged a glance. No visible injuries, no immediate danger. But I felt it, the weight in the air. The kind of heaviness that had nothing to do with physical pain and everything to do with a soul barely holding on. I softened my voice. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I don't want to be here anymore." And just like that, I knew. We stepped inside. The apartment was small, almost empty. No pictures on the walls. No warmth. Just a worn-out couch. An old coffee table. And stacks of unopened mail. Josh started running vitals, keeping his voice calm and steady. Have you been eating? Drinking water? She shrugged. Not really. Her pulse was weak, blood pressure low. She wasn't taking care of herself. But that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was why. I pulled up a chair, lowering myself to eye level with her. Can you tell me what's going on? I asked. She exhaled shakily. I don't see the point anymore. Her eyes flickered to the bottle of pills on the table, half empty. Josh met my gaze. We both knew how close this had been. I took a slow breath. You don't have to carry this alone. She let out a hollow laugh. That's easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like. I held her gaze. I do. She frowned. What? So, I told her. Not the whole story, just enough. About the moment my life stopped. About what I had seen. About how I had been given a choice to stay or go, and how. For a moment, I almost chose to let go. Her eyes filled with tears. But you came back. I nodded. Yeah, and I think maybe I was meant to sit here with you tonight. A tear slipped down her cheek. For the first time, she looked like she believed it. We stayed with her for a while. Not because she was in medical distress, but because she needed someone to sit in the darkness with her for a little while. She agreed to go to the hospital, to talk to someone, to get the help she needed. But before we left, she reached for my hand. Thank you, she whispered. I squeezed her fingers. You're not alone. And for the first time, she nodded like she believed it. Back in the ambulance, Josh let out a breath. That was different. Yeah, I agreed. He tapped the steering wheel before turning to me. You keep talking about being sent back. About having a purpose. I nodded. Josh hesitated, then said, Do you ever wonder why it was you? I swallowed, looking out at the city lights. I used to. And now? I met his gaze. Now I just focus on doing something with it. Josh exhaled. That woman. She needed someone tonight. Yeah, I said, and we were the ones who showed up. He nodded, thoughtful. Then, quietly, he admitted, I think I believe you now. I smiled, not because I had convinced him, but because he had seen it for himself. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more moments like that one. Moments where I didn't need to say much. I just needed to be there. For the exhausted nurse, who sat next to me in the break room and whispered, I don't know how much longer I can do this. For the grieving mother, who clutched my arm after losing her child and sobbed, please tell me he's okay. For the burned-out paramedic, who sat in the locker room after a rough call and admitted, I don't think I can take one more death. And every single time, I knew, this is why I was sent back. Not to fix everything, not to have all the answers, but to be present in the moments when people needed hope the most. Because sometimes, just knowing you're not alone is enough to keep you going. I don't know where this road is taking me. I don't know how many more lives I'll touch, or how many more conversations I'll have that change someone's path. But I do know this. I will keep showing up. Because the love I felt in that place, the love that pulled me back, was never just for me. It was for everyone. And if I can carry even a fraction of that into this world, then every moment I spend here, every breath, every call, every quiet conversation, will have been worth it. Lessons learned from my journey. Over the past year, since the night I died and came back, I have learned more about life, death, and purpose than I ever thought possible. Every conversation, every call, and every quiet moment of reflection has deepened my understanding of why I was sent back. These are the lessons that have shaped me, the truths I carry forward every day. 1. Death is not the end. Before my near-death experience, I had always viewed death as final, the ultimate, unavoidable ending. But now, I know with certainty, death is not the end. It is a transition, not an erasure. What I experienced on the other side was more real, more alive than anything here. The love, the presence, the sense of belonging. It all continues beyond this life. No one is ever truly gone. Love does not disappear. And for those left behind, grieving a loss that feels unbearable, your loved ones are still with you in ways you can't yet see. 2. Every moment matters. We tend to live like we have all the time in the world, like there will always be another day, another chance to say what needs to be said. But I have seen firsthand that life can change in an instant. Every call I respond to, Every moment spent with someone who is suffering or searching, it reminds me that we don't know how much time we have. So, I've learned. Say, I love you, more often. Forgive people, even when they don't ask for it. Be kind, even when no one is watching. Because at the end of our lives, the little moments are what matter the most. 3. Love is the strongest force in the universe. The love I felt on the other side was unlike anything on earth. It wasn't just an emotion, it was a force. A presence. The very fabric of existence. That love is not something we have to wait until death to experience. It's here, now, in the way we treat each other. Every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every time we choose love over fear, we are reflecting that eternal love into this world. The more love we give, the more we become connected to something greater than ourselves. 4. We are never alone. One of the most profound realizations from my experience was this. No one is ever truly alone. Not in life, not in death, even in our darkest moments. When we feel abandoned, when we feel like no one understands, we are held. I've seen it in the people I've encountered. The overdose patient who thought his life had no meaning. The grieving mother who begged for a sign that her son was okay. The exhausted paramedic who thought he was fighting a losing battle. In every one of those moments, something greater was there, guiding, comforting, reminding us that we are never truly alone. 5. Sometimes, just being there is enough. I used to believe that my job as a paramedic was about saving lives. And it is, but I've come to understand that not every save is physical. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is just be there. To sit with someone in their grief. To remind them that they are seen, heard, and valued. To hold space for someone when they feel like they can't go on. Presence is powerful. It's not always about fixing something. It's about letting people know they don't have to walk through the darkness alone. 6. We all have a purpose. For a long time, I asked myself, why me? Why was I sent back when so many others weren't? Why did I get a second chance? The answer wasn't some grand revelation, it was simple. Because I still had work to do. And I believe that's true for everyone. If you are here, if you are breathing, if your heart is still beating, then you still have a purpose. It might not be something massive. It might just be showing up for the people in your life. Being kind to a stranger. Or offering comfort to someone in pain. But make no mistake, your life has meaning. You are here for a reason. 7. Faith is not about having all the answers. Before my experience, I thought faith was about certainty, about knowing all the right things. Believing all the right doctrines. Now, I understand. Faith is about trust, not certainty. I don't have all the answers. I don't know why some people are called home sooner than others. I don't know why suffering exists. But I do know this. There is something greater than us. We are deeply loved beyond comprehension. Life is not random. There is meaning behind every experience, even the painful ones. Faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about choosing to trust even when we don't. 8. Our stories have the power to change lives. At first, I didn't want to share my story. I was afraid people wouldn't believe me. Afraid they would dismiss it. Afraid they would think I was crazy. But the more I shared, the more I realized, this story isn't just for me. Every time I tell it, someone finds hope. Someone who has been afraid of death. Someone who has been carrying grief they don't know how to let go of. Someone who has been searching for proof that this life is not all there is. And now, I know, we all have stories that can change lives. Your experiences, your pain, your victories, they aren't just for you. They are meant to help someone else who is walking through the same thing. So, don't be afraid to share your story. Because you never know whose life it might save. Final thoughts. I don't know how much time I have left. None of us do. But I do know this. I will not waste the time I've been given. I will keep showing up. I will keep loving people fiercely. I will keep reminding others that they are not alone. That they are loved. That life is worth fighting for. Because in the end, when my time here is truly done, I want to leave knowing I lived fully, loved deeply, and left this world a little better than I found it. And I hope, when that day comes, I will be greeted by the same love I once felt, knowing that I carried a piece of it with me every day I was given. That, more than anything, is what I have learned. And that is what I will keep living for.